So let me start with Hitesh. Yours is easily the largest jobs database in the country. Um, One of the things I've been wondering about is that yours is a database business. You give recruiters access to the database. How do they? Can you run us through how they get? Like, are they able to download files, or they given the limited access? How have you decided what sort of personal information they should get access to, and how do you have any controls over how they can use it?
Yeah. So let me explain how this whole thing works. So, job seekers are free to register on the platform. So it's a free registration. You can upload. So we have some mandatory fields like your, location and so on, basically, so that you throw up, you get discovered in the search. But beyond that, there aren't too many fields which are sort of mandatory. You can also attach a Word document, which is your Word CV. And then what happens is all this sort of information goes into a database, and so it's just the CV. There's nothing beyond the CV, right? And there's no financial information, nothing of that sort. And then recruiters can search the database. So they basically, a typical search would be, listen, I'm looking for people with Java experience, with between 2 to 4 years experience in Bangalore, that's it. And the search could throw up hundreds or thousands of matches. And then you may say, okay, you may want to narrow down further and say, listen, I want to sort of, okay, not just Java, but maybe this also and this also. Maybe the guy should also not just be an engineer, but also an MBA. So you can apply sort of various other filters to narrow down the result set. And then post that, you can send an email to the person if you are interested in that person, or in offering a job to that person. You typically email a job to that person, or you can contact that person by phone. Okay, and the way our business model works is that we sell access to the database for a fee, and in that access you get to view a certain number of CVs. So we sell the entire database, so you get access to search the entire database, but view up to a X number of CVs, and beyond that you have to pay more. So it's pay per use in that sense.
Do you have any limitations in terms of how long they can retain the data? I mean, how do you prevent someone taking the data, taking a CV and not selling it forward? There's a recent case, for example, in case of one of your competitors, where they've essentially been sued for selling their entire database. So how does this work?
No. So see, the data is the intel inside, as far as we are concerned. So we don't want to sell. We would never sell the entire database, because what that would mean is that a competitor would come up tomorrow, right? People give us their data because they trust us, and for a reason, because we work with 70,000 companies, and they sort of hope to get a job through us. We estimate, of course, we don't have numbers, that at least 3 to 4 million of people sort of find jobs through Naukri every year. To answer your question on how do we ensure that people who access these CVs don't misuse them or don't sort of use them later, very hard for us to do that, because see, companies before Naukri.com have been sort of listing jobs in newspapers forever, and people used to apply to them. And after that, and the truth about India is that actually companies don't want all these resumes, right? Because when they put up a job, they get 1,000 applications, they want to hire one person, right? So they actually, for them, the remaining 999 resumes are junk. So they remain in their email, they remain in sort of wherever they remain, and they sort of follow up with maybe the 10 people they shortlist and end up making one offer. What happens to those CVs after that, we have no control. We have no idea. Not just from the data he's taken, but even for the jobs that people are applying to. There are people who come to our site and apply to 100 jobs a day sometimes, because they're looking for a job, and sometimes they're desperate as well. And so they send their CV to 100 places. There is no way for us to track what happened to the CV after it went to those 100 places. That's the nature of the game. And the more you sort of keep your job search private, and if you say, listen, I don't want to send my CV to anybody, you're not going to get a job, right? So there is a trade-off here. And this has been going on for years.
So I think, as I mentioned in the starting, because we are not looking at monetizing through ads, so to that extent, all our data capturing is largely to enhance and create patterns about customer experience and about content usage. What kind of shows are working, what kind of gender is, watching, what kind of show, what kind of day parting is happening, when is the peak usage happening. So every element of data that we collect goes into the furtherance of improving the app and creation of future content buckets. From a privacy policy standpoint, it of course is in confirmation with, what rule of law here in this country. And because we are global as well, as I said, that we are live in about 70 plus geographies, so we have to conform to such jurisdictions as well. And to that extent, I think we are pretty compliant.
So is there a different approach you've taken to different jurisdictions?
Oh yes,
Can
absolutely.
you?
So, for example, in geographies like US and UK, where you have to conform to in UK or in entire EU to their set of privacy. So then your collection of data is delimited only to that extent, vis-a-vis other geographies where privacy laws are not yet mature. For example, when we just launched a show which is in Bengali, we saw a usage peak happening within 24 hours of trailer going live from Dhaka, of all the places, right? So do I need to go back and check what my privacy alterations need to be so far as Dhaka is concerned, right? So to that extent, we do all course corrections wherever required.
So one of the things that I'm kind of concerned about is that, let's say, and this is going to come up even in the consent panel, is that when I'm downloading an app, I give permission to access my my SMS because there's an OTP there, right? And so I've heard of situations where there are apps that are there which are just essentially uploading people's entire SMS history, and potentially mining that data. Are there particular permissions that you think need to change? You've looked at the permissions ecosystem. You would earlier would ask me how and also looking at the product piece over there, right? So, what is it is there something that makes you feel uncomfortable about the kind of permissions being taken? How do you think they can be improved?
Oh yeah. So I think if you draw out a distinct parallel between iOS ecosystem and on Android ecosystem, I'm sure the guys who have played with technology and platforms here do realize that Android lends itself to extraction of lot more data, which otherwise is not possible on iOS. Now, who do you go and impute that responsibility to is to anybody's guess, right? Is there a rule of law which allows them or which disallows them not to do that? Again, I guess anybody's guess, right? Taking a step back, I think the larger issue, and if you which was also resonated in recent book which came out by Vivek Wadhwa as well, that Moore's law, which applies on tech, also applies on regulation qua privacy as well. So technology, rather than seeking permission, should be seeking forgiveness from the society, because regulation, if history has taught us one thing, has always had a laggard approach in catching up with technology. And that's where I guess rule makers have a very important role to play, to create that kind of regulatory regime that compels all the players at play to ensure that they comply with it.
So someone in the room just SMS'd me, just WhatsApped me your permissions, and the question is, why do you take phone and SMS permissions?
We take phone and SMS permissions from all standpoint, largely to let you know when is the next show releasing, when is the next payment trigger happening, when are you going to let go of expiry of your subscription, your renewal reminders, etc.
But calling?
So if you've had any such issues that we have faced on our panel regarding the payments, regarding hanging of the app, and also so calling is just one function of collection of your mobile number. It is not the end to it, right?
So therefore, from that perspective, ability for the app to make a call has to be different from the ability of the of just getting a mobile number in that sense, right? And the permissions. Okay. There's this entire debate that's been going on that privacy is a small price to pay for access to the services that people are getting. What's your take on that?
That's kind of like jumping into a Shark Tank if you try to answer that question. So I might just give a little bit of background because I might come from a slightly different world than a lot of people in this room. So the people I work with have been working on questions of financial inclusion and access for about like 10 years now at least, right? And we work with about 8 lakh households, trying to get a kind of more sophisticated approach to wealth management for poorer people, as opposed to just pushing credit or pushing any one product. Anyway, that's the kind of headline. So why we wandered into this space is, the majority of us as Indians are living, 70% of us live in villages. It's a stat that everybody knows, but I like to reiterate. So the majority of you and me, people like you and me, all of our countrymen women are in the villages, and majority also make about less than 10,000 across rural and urban per month. And there's this big digital initiative, basically, and that's why we're interested, because if this is the coming trend, currently, I would say, in my personal opinion, adoption isn't high. I think if you look at transaction data analysis or across digital payments, which everyone loves to talk about these days, there was an uptick after demonetization, and we all know that it's kind of gone down again. So this is, for people like us in the tier 1 kind of cities, upwardly mobile, this is the consumer base that a lot of these apps are targeting. I think why I'm here and why I do my job is in 10 years' time, if all the 70% of our kind of compatriots are accessing this stuff, what needs to be in place? Because we can take a hit if the transaction goes down and we're out 1,000 rupees for 3 days while the complaint settles. What happens if you're operating on a thinner margin? So that's just kind of my pitch. Quickly, just to respond to your question, actually. So I think a couple of things here. If you look at this trade-off, we actually don't think that needs to exist at all. So there's not a trade-off between, it's just how well your app is built. And if we're looking specifically at the app ecosystem.
So that trade-off also was mentioned in the Supreme Court.
Exactly. And you know that they mentioned that we don't believe in such a trade-off. So our constitution isn't built on the fact that you have to destroy certain individual freedoms in order to have development. And I think that's kind of the line we're going to take for the next 100 years also, I hope. So if that's the case, so we ran a little exercise. So I'm just, my work does a lot of other things, but I thought for the purposes of this panel, I'd flag something up that a friend of mine called Nishant and a colleague is doing. We've parked it, but we want to get back into it, which is about apps, financial apps. So we scraped data from the Google Play Store for about 1,000 apps under the finance kind of category. And we just had a look at permissions and what's going on there. And it's interesting because you see banking access, especially taking an average of between 2 to 34 permissions, right? And we took one banking app which took 34 permissions and another one which took 2 to perform the same service. And I mean, I don't know if I should name them. I mean, it's public information. So yeah, one is a Bank of Baroda app and the other one is the IOB app. And
sorry, which one took more data?
Bank of Baroda took... Yeah, no, it's all there. He's got his code up on GitHub as well. I can send it around on an email. I've plugged it before in another conference. So everybody can look at this. 34 for Bank of Baroda and 2 for IOB, I think. So I mean, I guess that brings us to kind of just 3 questions that I wanted to quickly put out there as part of the discussion. And welcome to the next panelist. The first one is, clearly there's something around here around essential data to provide a service and opt-out data. And like, why aren't we making that distinction? If we want more people to, and consumers might not care because for various reasons we've discussed, they don't know what's behind the hood, So what can industry do to kind of do that while regulation catches up? And I do believe it will. The other thing is, I think, Manav, you brought up this really interesting point on Android data. And I think that brings up this whole intermediary question. Because I think Google App Store and I think intermediaries per se have had to take some level of responsibility now in the absence of providers doing it themselves. So there's definitely a question there for intermediaries, but they are only part of the solution. So we can, the App Store lists these permissions and now they've started doing certain more hygiene. What should providers be doing beforehand? And what can you do instead of trying to get other people to kind of do that for you and kind of, so the incentives aren't aligned. Google wants to put more apps up, and they want safe apps because they don't want consumers to leave. So they'll only do testing to that point. So that's just one thing I think which is very important. And the last thing is how do we tackle this question of purpose limitation, right? Which we all love to talk about. The fact is that how do you make the data you have collected relate to the function that you're doing? And again, it's not like we're operating in a vacuum. There's a CFSI paper, a couple of my colleagues who work with me have been looking at OPSI or something, I can send a couple of links, where these industry associations are talking about time-limited consent and time-limited collection, so that 10 days later, you automatically kind of delete if you're looking at data minimization practice. And if you want to perform that function, you basically go in there and you pull that data again. You specifically request that data again. Obviously, these are at one end of the spectrum, but there are fixes there. So it would be great, I think, to have a graded conversation about data. Like, I think that point we discussed in the morning was very important. You can't talk about data in a vacuum. We have to break down types of data and have better rights for some and, looser rights for some others.
My name is Mrinal Sinha. I am the Chief Operating Officer of MobiQuick. And I think to jump right to the question, we collect 2 or 3 different types of data and for the following purposes. So we collect people's location data because first of all, I think we're a payments platform, but then I think we're also a platform where a lot of our users are trying to access deals from local offline merchants in their vicinity. And so unless somebody enables that feature, we're unable to tell a user like what stores in his area would do home delivery, what medicine stores are there. And we see a lot of people access, even let's say midnight around, what are the medicine stores in their vicinity that would do home delivery. So, I think there is give and take for data. There should obviously be, governance around access to data. But, I heard one of the panelists mention about purpose limitation. Quite often, we as consumers ourselves don't know enough about what purposes we would like to limit it to or not. Therefore, I'm personally in the camp of time-limited consents, erring more towards that side where, if an app is providing useful information, then every time like they refresh their permission, the user will give it. But I think purpose limitation, then you kind of get into what purposes, what we are trying to do today may be a little bit different from what we are attempting to do 3 months down the line. And so, I think purpose limitation often has, it actually limits the user themselves. So for instance, another type of data that we are reading is we're reading, financial data around what sort of, EMIs people are paying because, a lot of the folks that access MobiQuick are lower in income, don't have CIBIL scores, and guess what? We are introducing credit for them. And I think like there is a consumer purpose that at that end, and certainly a user should have the right to deny that data to me. But I think like I would err more on the side of time limited consents as opposed to putting too many strictures on purpose limited.
So now for the tough question, right? We've seen the financial payments ecosystem now. We've seen it earlier as well when it comes to giving loans. There are now lending-based startups which have come up. The RBI was talking about a public credit registry where everyone's credit history is going to get stored so that companies like yours can build on top of it and collect additional mobile usage data and other forms of data and essentially provide something called flow-based lending where you don't have to give collateral, but on the basis of your payment history, you're allowed to give loans. Just setting that as a base understanding of how it works. There's another danger when it comes to this sort of data collection, which we're seeing in case of the all the payday loan companies in the UK, for example, right, where it is being used in a predatory manner, where just because they know that someone at some point in time is running out of money, they're targeting them more aggressively from that perspective. So where do you draw the line and how do you regulate a situation like that, Malvika and Mrinal, if you could address that, and what are the dangers? Because we've seen something like this happen in case of microfinance where there wasn't that amount of data, right? Mrinal and then Malvika.
I would err on the side of better implementation as opposed to more regulation, because that's what is more effective and that's where we are weak, right? So if you find and the reason I say that is the following, right? All the ways in which data can be misused, no regulator even knows it, nor could any subset of it get together and said, hey, like these are the 80% cases in which data could be misused, so let's create regulation around it and we're done, right? I mean, it's just, it's, I think the human mind is highly creative. People who want to really misuse it can misuse it in a lot of ways. So, to be proactive and figure out all the ways in which you can misuse and put regulations around it, that's not a good purpose. That's self-defeating, because all the good things which you can happen, which people could do with more freedom around data, you prevent that from happening. So what do you do to address the point you said, right? The moment you find any kind of misdemeanor, come down so heavily on any of them that proves to be enough of a deterrent for anybody else doing it, right? And I think that's where the ecosystem regulations, all the folks should go, as opposed to put down too many kind of strictures around, this is okay, that's not okay. Your microfinance example, like I think if in the early days, somebody had come down, really, really heavily, a lot of it could have been prevented. But I think people waited long enough, and then, they came up with a set of guidelines which almost kind of killed the industry. That's what you don't want to do. That's not how you want to address it.
Uber over here, and Uber's cheating case with Apple. That geofencing Cupertino, and Uber wasn't kicked off the App Store, right? But when Uber's been playing around with permissions, they've been tracking phones, and this is a fairly well-known company. I mean, you have, smaller apps I don't trust. And I use an iPhone for one of those reasons, because on an iPhone I know there is a much greater level of app security than on Android. But what do you do then? You said come down hard. But what if an app is cheating? What if an app decides and doesn't get caught? Uber just happened to get caught. I'm sure there are other examples of people who are taking stuff and haven't been caught. And by the time they get caught, they've taken much more than, what do? You can't dial the clock back.
So, you surface a legitimate concern, right? And let's address that, right? But I think, let me first make a counterpoint to what you said. At a certain point in time, people treated location data, not that long ago, right? Like 6, 7, 8 years ago, people thought location data was sacrosanct, that users shouldn't share their location data even if, somebody gave their consent. Now, if that had happened, right, and Uber wouldn't exist. And, I use the exact same example that you gave, right? This is a country in which public transportation system, no government has been able to solve it. Let's agree with one thing. Our government does not have the wherewithal to solve public transportation. Really, like that's what we've seen in the history of this country. I've grown up here, you have. So, let's give it to Uber.
I don't think that's specifically answering the question.
I'll come to it.
What do you
right?
do about the bad guys?
Part one, I think, so part one is, if the point that I mentioned is, if you are too punitive and try to put kind of strictures around it, then you prevent genuine problems from getting solved, like transportation, which is what Uber is solving. Okay, so the bad guys around it, like I think you just have to be punitive to them.
One of the reasons why we often go into a kind of spiral in these kind of conversations is because of the thing that actually you were talking about, Mrinal, is that we do very prescriptive case-by-case rule setting, right? And legally, this is called kind of a rules-based approach as opposed to a principles-based approach. Now, the idea is, if you start mixing up case-by-case analysis, this is why examples are terrible in any discussion, because every example will have a countered example, which is why you move a level up to a principles-based, right? So what law does, and just to give you a small, I'll try not to make it look like a lecture, but there are like two parts of any policy and legal model. One is the fact that there's something happening, right? And you have a regulation which comes in and kind of sets the rules of the game, and that needs to be set on a principles level. And the other part is that after the activity is happening, you need to supervise to ensure that there are no bad guys, right? And fundamentally let people play in that ecosystem. Now, there's two major issues here. Again, on the principles level, we all seem to assume that people just operate in a vacuum and there are no law, like, it's kind of, there's no single economic transaction out there that just happens like in a total market with no kind of society around it. Law is society, there's a society, there's some kind of thing, and then there are already existing kind of limitations on what you can't and can't do with every type of activity, and then you're free to do whatever. So we need to basically agree in this country what is the floor when it comes to personal data use. So bring it to the sector's personal data. It's not like any of the other sectors that we use as examples, which are important to use from, but essentially what is the floor that we are setting in terms of what can and can't be done with personal data. And then we develop specific use cases as we go, and the supervisor fits in. Now, the reason why I kind of gave this law class here is because of two reasons, right? When we come to setting the rules of the game, Renal, I do think that there's some role here to think about ex ante, to use the economic speak. What are the harms for the consumer? And to say, not to say, Uber should charge this rupees this for this state, right? Because that's rules-based, but to say at a principles-based level, listen, if your differential pricing goes to a point where someone's paying 1,000 rupees for one trip and the other person's paying 30 rupees, something's going on here. We must not cause harm, undue financial harm to the consumer, right? So what we can do is set an objective goalpost, have a kind of idea of what harms a consumer should not face, and then say, you guys go deal with how you're going to implement to ensure that these harms don't occur. And the great thing is, and where I am, right, in this ecosystem, technology is a great enabler for access, right? Now, it's never going to be binary. People who are saying we need to worry about harms also want access to technology. I want access to technology. My life has changed because of Uber, right? So the question is, how can you ensure the benefits happening without any of the harms? And I think we all agree, I've never met a single person who thinks actually, a consumer harm shouldn't be embedded in the law, like a standard against, like nobody wants to be defrauded, missold a product, have an identity theft happen to them. So I think part of the answer here is figuring out ex ante, what are the harms we don't want, and what kinds of data collection leads to that kind of harm, and therefore what kind of limited types of data are we not, or types of data practices are we not okay with.
One of the things which you spoke about was this entire desperation, that people have outsourced. And for me, and so this is for me, how do you balance, this is a small 10-second story. When I first applied for a cell phone plan in the US, they said, give us your social security number. If you don't give your social security number, you can't get a cell phone. And to me, that was a denial of service. That if you don't give us this much private information, we will not give you this service. And of course, there's a public, there's private, and you have to protect an enterprise's right to refuse admission of service. How do you balance that within your company, and how do you see it in the general startup ecosystem, where you say, look, we are providing an essential solution, we are providing an essential service, which might become as essential as being locking people out of entire ecosystems, but you have to pay with your data to get access to that service, and then how does that control evolve in your mind?
See, in our case, we are asking for data which will help you get what you want, to provide service to you, right? So, see, we are a company which is driven by, we are very customer driven, and our customers are both job seekers and recruiters. So what we want to do is provide the best possible service to them. To provide the best possible service to both job seekers and recruiters, which essentially means, see, we're a matching platform. We want to basically enable more matches through our platform. To enable more matches through our platform, what do we need to do a good job, right? We need a certain minimum data on the job seeker side, and we need some data from the recruiter as well. Often recruiters won't give us all the data they sort of need to give us for us to do a good job, because if you have a 3-line job posting, we don't really know what you're looking for, right? Nor do the job seekers. So our entire sort of effort is to understand, what is it that we need? And, we are at a certain stage, our algorithms are at a certain stage of sort of in their life cycle. What do our algorithms need to do a better job of enabling more matches? That's the information we want. We don't want any other information from our recruiters. We don't want anything else from our job seekers. This information is to help them, right? And we actually ideally would want to move to a system. Today we are more search driven. In fact, on the job seeker side, we're becoming more and more recommendation driven, where once they give us their data, they don't even have to search. We sort of recommend jobs to them to save them time, right? We want to do the same thing on the recruiter side, so that we actually don't give the data to them. See, today what happens is we give our entire database to them and say, okay, look, you search for whoever you want, right? What we actually want to do ideally, which will, and again, it'll benefit both the entire ecosystem, is that once we know what the requirement is, our algorithms work at the back end and recommend profiles to them of people we think they should be meeting. But till the time we get to their level, that level, which is sort of acceptable, we have to sort of do this. So there is database which is available on our website, but there are maybe 70,000 private databases available inside corporations. Right? One doesn't know what's happening to that data. There's so much data inside corporations. There's email data inside corporations. There is WhatsApp data inside corporations. There is so much other data floating around inside corporations, right? As well. Why? We have no idea what's happening there. What we try and ensure is that we sell to the right people. We have a KYC system in place, right? But even that can be bypassed. Somebody wants to sort of, buy data and say, listen, I want to use it for hiring, but tomorrow you decide to use it to sell cards. It's very hard for us to detect that. But what we try and ensure is that we don't sort of give out information which people would be upset with if that information is given out. We don't even want to ask for such information, actually. So we have paid services on Jeevan Saathi. Even today, we don't ask for credit card numbers because we're not so sure, right? So we say, listen, it's okay, right? We don't save credit card numbers. So our sort of, and a real business, when they're running a real business operation, the people are concerned about their reputation. We don't want to lose our reputation. We build that reputation over time. Tomorrow, if word spreads that Naukri.com, this is what they do with your data, or this is what Jeevan Saathi does with your data, we'll lose business. So we want to guard against that, right? So actually, for us, we have the right incentives in place. We don't even use Naukri data for Jeevan Saathi, by the way. Inside the same company, we don't take Naukri data. We know that this guy is 23 years old and he's looking for a job, and maybe he'll get married maybe tomorrow. And so many people ask us, why don't you use that data? We don't use that data because we don't have permission. Right? So there is, I think companies should sort of maybe self-regulate them. Maybe they should publish what they use their data for. Maybe there are, I don't know how sort of the whole system can be made to work better. But I think it is in the interest of companies to do this more than anybody else.
Hi, Benavi from Mozilla. First, just a point of clarification, all major carriers in the United States will give you an account without a social security number.
Not a postpaid one. Yes, no.
You just need to actually give a greater financial deposit. But my intervention was really, I want to sort of pick up on the principles sort of piece here. You mentioned sort of the principle of do not harm, which I think is critical when we sort of think about data collection and about sort of privacy and data protection frameworks. I want to also suggest that we consider no surprises as a principle. And that this needs to be sort of part of our paradigm for how we as companies who collect varying amounts of data and interact with users sort of think through how do we communicate with users, how do we think about our data collection and processing decisions. I think that one of the panelists sort of commented that there's sort of too much data to do purpose limitation. I think purpose limitation in implementation is a function primarily of political will. Right? I think you need to have people on every team whose responsibility is looking at the data that's being collected, the consent for which, the purpose for which consent was given. And we have, for example, at Mozilla, a system of data stewards where every engineering team, for example, has to have someone who is on point to look at those data collection and processing decisions that liaises very closely with our compliance teams, with our legal teams, with our policy teams, and really sort of looking at this. And so I think that when we all sit down, whether that's the engineers or the policy staff or the legal staff, compliance staff, and look at these data collection decisions, we sort of look at sort of what is the user benefit here and what is the business benefit. And it's okay to have differences sometimes, but we want to make sure that those are pretty close together and that we have a strong user benefit story that we can tell behind every data collection decision. And I think when you have that, it's really not hard to go tell the user in a very transparent way, this is the data that we want to collect and this is how we're going to do it and this is why and this is what's going to happen. I think when we hear about sort of a recruiting platform, it's pretty easy to tell a story of how, we want to collect this data to be able to provide this kind of feature to you. And I think that it's important to do that to tell that story, to be transparent to the user. And so my sort of question in the spirit of this discussion is sort of to ask our esteemed panelists, sort of what are your firms, how do you approach the sort of data collection question? Sort of what are sort of the guiding principles or sort of theories that go into those decisions and sort of the values that you try and do?
So, on purpose limitation, so very often we hear that you can run all these machine learning algorithms and who knows what variable is correlated with what, right? So, for example, kite flying predicts good credit risk. Okay? These kinds of relationships have, I know correlation is not causation, but how do companies, so when we say purpose limitation, ex ante, I may not know that this variable is a good predictor of something, but if I ran that algorithm, maybe there is a benefit to be had from using one more proxy for, say, good credit risk. How do companies think about data collection from that perspective?
So I think there's separate questions. So first, Shikha and then anyone want to take a dig at how does your company look at
What data to collect?
not just what data, but also aligning teams towards respecting user data? I mean, I'll give you a small example. DLF, you go into one of the cyber city whatever places, they want to scan your identity card. So I asked for a privacy policy. They didn't know what that means.
And they sell it also.
So they sell it? Do you know anyone who's bought it?
No.
Okay.
I heard about this.
No, but I think you raise a very interesting point. And while at the top, companies may be very clear on what data they want and why they want data, but one doesn't know often what's happening at the ground level.
I mean, how many people do you have in the company?
We have 4,000 people, but the number of people who sort of deal with the product is very limited, and and so on. But you're right. Sometimes short-term business needs may sort of take over the sort of and people at the top may not know what's happening. So maybe it's a good idea. I mean, just a thought. I mean, and where to sort of for every company or to have a designated data protection sort of person inside the company, right? And that person should be fully sort of versed with what happens inside that company in the area of data protection. He or she should be fully versed with the policies of the company, and maybe everything should be sort of routed through that person if it involves sort of changes in the policy. And like for example, when you're a public company, we have a company secretary, right? So in a public company, so that person has a sort of role, and he's also answerable to the Department of Company Affairs in some sense, right? So maybe that's a way forward. I don't know.
Mrinal, you have financial data.
Yeah, so I think there's
Mike.
there's data collection, and then what do you do with data, and what do you and what different people in company in the company or in a business do with data, and how, which is important. So almost by design, the way we look at it is the moment you get to data which is an individual's data and you're getting to a specific user, it is highly dangerous, because then somebody an employee who has access to it and you don't have the kinds of policies in place, he could do all kinds of things with it. So long as you're doing stuff which is aggregated and where identities are masked, and let's say you're looking at location information for 100,000 people, that's okay for employees to access or different parties to access it within a company. But the chief, the data compliance officer is a good idea. Like that, at MobiKwik, we have kind of policies on, if an individual data has to be accessed. Well, first of all, pretty much no one has access to it. If it has to be accessed, then need to be 3-4 level of signatories, and a case has to be made on why a certain individual's data has to be accessed. So I think some of this is organic, but you need to decide at what level monitoring data and usage of data gets into the dangerous territory. That being said, I think in general, I think the data that you're collected, there is current use of data, and then there is future use of data, right? To create like new IPs and new services, etc. So some of these decisions on what data to collect and purpose limitations, you have to balance it with that. Quick example is if Google didn't use Google Maps data like 3 years ago from all of us, then we wouldn't be able to have traffic prediction today. Which is a very useful feature. But did they know they were going to do this 3 years ago? Answer is no.
You had a point to make?
I mean, a couple of things are just coming to my mind as we speak through this, right? I mean, one thing is this future data point is essential. I think the idea here is when you have features which are additional or opt-in, or so there's those kind of features. I feel somewhere maybe we are missing a trick in terms of thinking through how is the user being looped into this decision. That's it, I think. And we all understand that people have cognitive constraints when it comes to valuing personal data. However, I think we need to somewhere think about when you're offering that feature, who is making that decision about whether the user knows or doesn't know. And I think there is a role somewhere to say, at that point where that new feature is added, what can a provider do to kind of flag it up to the user that, listen, hey, we collected this data from you and we're using it for something else. Otherwise, what data you want, maybe that's the point to collect it. When you've had your training data set, build the feature, and then instead of just reusing data that was harvested for something else, I think it might be. And this is where I think actually I am going to push a little bit, because I think it's easy to collect these data these days, and we know, coming to kind of Renuka's point, we know that a lot of the data that's collected is not always useful. And I come back from a finance background again, to take this to digital credit especially, and give you 2 non-Indian examples. So you have somebody called, say, Microcred, that uses only behavioral data. They operate in 10 or 12 countries, and they say it's not who you are, but what you do that matters. On the other end, you have something like Credit Tech, which uses 20,000 proxies, right? And they've got like the gold standard algorithm in the world. Now, no one knows what's working for whom, right? Yet. We don't have enough to say, we know certain things are good predictors, past repayments, transaction history in relation to those kind of repayments. And this is what credit bureaus have always used. Things we're using now, like whether you sort your contacts by first name or last name, these are untested. Like that, this somehow relates to creditworthiness, are untested. So I feel like as you test and learn, it's important to also kind of use a training set, but not use your entire consumer base as, as a way to learn. I think somewhere there is room to say, we're going to get rid of this, we're going to go and collect this from everybody when we need it. So that's kind of my pushback to that particular point. On the other one, actually, I was just thinking, the reason why we're again interested in this space is there's a trend of disintermediation in finance that's happening, that you are having players who traditionally don't come into personal sensitive financial data, who are doing so. So when we've done a kind of landscaping of regulation in the country from a financial services perspective, and the thing is that personal, like mobile money apps and personal finance management apps, or even enabling apps like Chiller, for instance, don't fall within any guidelines of the RBI, SEBI, IRDA, and all of that. So now this is where you have a situation where you have a person who actually is not an expert in dealing with sensitive financial information, or even if they're not expert, just someone who's done it for many, many years, coming in with a very quick, easy, strong technology business model that's adding value to that process, who are completely outside of the financial sector regulation, right? And they only have the information technology regulation to manage personal and sensitive personal information. Now, this is why I think there's a real opportunity for providers in India to actually change that dynamic, and to not be, to kind of set the tone in terms of, we are not, we are a technology business working with a bank. So we are not a financial sector entity, but we are handling all the sensitive information. It's going to happen in health. It's going to happen in every other sensitive. That's where you can really change the game in terms of your data practices, and actually say, we're going to do this data minimization approach, or we are going to, kind of go back to users, so that, because regulation will catch up, right? So it's better to be wizened in advance, rather than when you're in the gray space, kind of take the view that once we have the data, we are going to use it for everything else for the next 20 years. I just think that
Objective reply to that is yes, because if you look at all these examples which you took, namely Uber or Google or FB, and also Indian startups and Paytm of the world and Mobikwik of the world, none of these businesses had underlying model of exploiting the data. The data became a collateral, right? And what you use, and I think when Aap guy was, talking about the misuse of data, and Prashant started to say that if Uber had approached any of the political parties saying that here is it that you have the data, that's when you can, impute the responsibility on the entity which is collecting the data. Fact of the matter is, you pick any country, any jurisdiction, any app, including social security numbers out of US as well, they have been leaked in the past, right? The time, I'm actually waiting when the part of the blockchain will be leaked, right? So to say that any amount of data, any place secure on the planet will not be leaked, I think you are in some kind of oblivion. Objectively replying to your point, once the rules are in place, the business models will evolve, because the underlying models were never built on exploitation of data. There was a business model in place, there is a business model in place, and there will be one.
It's very easy to finger point at big business, because it's easy to finger point at big business, they're big, Now, the problem is, forget big business for a while, let's make a decision for ourselves. Today I handed out 10 business cards. Now these guys can send me a LinkedIn invite, they can add me on Facebook, they can follow me on Twitter, And my expectation was, and they can start sending me SMS also. There's a common understanding that the protocol developed that, okay, I may met this person in a professional context, so I will only send probably LinkedIn invite or ask for an introduction, right? When a industry is nascent, it's very easy to take an absolute principle-based approach, but who will set the deadline when principle need to be revised? Even Constitution has provision for revision, right? Oftentimes the ideological people can afford to be ideological because they don't have a stake in the game. They're not running the business, And what if my adherence to good data policy, will lose my, I end up losing my customer funnel because of that. That background location tracking example of Uber, that has a clear and well-defined user benefit that when you in a low battery condition, when you open the app, it doesn't take long to define your location and basically send the nearest cab to you. There's a clear, the algorithm take very little time. That's why Uber seems fast, because they're already working in the background. It's very hard to, algo is not good to begin with at the time of taking the permission, and maybe it's very hard to define that thing. So these things are not black and white. So
can I just quickly respond to that as well? Because I think that this is, I think this is, and I completely agree that, this is not the job of businesses per se, and it shouldn't be, because the incentives aren't aligned, and that's the job of regulation. So actually that's good, actually. We kind of agree, but from different perspectives. The other thing, but I do think that that's why we need a principles-based approach, because then you can't, principles mean principles, they don't mean specifics. And specifics need to evolve for each industry and each data type. So the kind of principle you might take with regard to proxies, what you're using the data when it comes to dealing with health, specifically with people with terminal illnesses, specifically with big HIV data sets, which we do need to understand. And there's a great example in the morning discussion from how we deal with that, right? Because globally we need to understand how the trend, how the movements are happening, but individually there are significant risks. So
who decides the principle?
Yeah, so the principle, the broad principle will be collection, say, if you have a principle against collection, but how that varies from industry to industry must be different. Because I might not care that Burger King knows that I like Coke with my burger, right? But I might care that my health insurer knows that I have 6 burgers a day. So the question is, your health regulation needs to be different. And I know people don't have a lot of patience for granularity when it comes to these discussions, but my plea to this audience, a very evolved audience, is that we need to make a distinction between a kind of symptom of a disease and the disease itself, set the principle, and then roll it out for your industry. Think for your own industry. I mean, we are doing thinking for finance,
Can I have one example?
Comment and then
Okay, yeah. So I'll give you one example which will kind of explain the fuzziness of the gray areas. There's a very big company, I'm not going to name. Their translation tool is industry standard. Worldwide people are using it. When the translation tool was launched in the version 1, they were not able to do a good job because they didn't have the good training data set. From where did they get the good training data set? From the meeting notes of UN assemblies, because they had the best translation being done of each country. They trained the algorithm on that. Now, was that data captured for the purpose of training this company's data set? No.
But is there a harm?
There's no harm. So now
then we don't have to worry about it. Like, let's all do business and be happy. I'm being facetious, but I'm basically saying, see, if you have a principle around harm, then we wouldn't even be having this discussion, because this is not the place of regulation. Yeah, but there are, you can say
post
that
facto.
if that
harm
was
can only be decided post facto.
No. So what I'm saying is, in this situation, again, because we are in the business of examples, in this situation, there's no harm from there. That's fine, right? Now, if it was being used by, say, an alternative credit lender, right, in order to profile people, how people speak, say, in a particular kind of community, say, black people in a particular place, and say, actually, they are terrible credit. That's a harm. And that's what your financial regulation should be saying. You can't use this kind of program, this kind of algorithm in your credit model, right? If it's creating this, if these are the effects. And that can be done. And I'm happy to point you to some regulatory thinking that's happening. There is a level of ex-ante speaking.
That has failed. Hispanic community was systematically targeted in the financial crisis because of the race. Yeah. And not a single person was kind of convicted because of that.
No, so the thing is, we can argue about which principles haven't been extended well. That's an implementation question. But if we all agree, Yeah, I mean, this is like a foundational, like programmers talk about how code is written. There's a way that we agree to make rules amongst each other as lawyers, as society, right? You can't, like, saying that it's failed in one thing, you're striking at the heart of how we organize society. We say it doesn't work. We know it works. In 100, the reason we're having this conversation is there are certain rules around how we can organize as a society, what kinds of things we can say that we all buy into, right? And sometimes it fails. Sometimes people don't respect speech, and you have problems. But we can't give up on speech regulation. I'm pulling again from examples in other places, in other types of law. But what I'm saying is when it comes to data, there is a lot of, we have this data exceptionalism when it comes to talking about data. This applies equally to like new fintechs as it does to banks, right? And all of these people have been collecting data for years. So we can look at data practice. There are lessons there. It's just that the amplitude has changed. So I do find that this principles-based approach has been the way that we've organized society for years. We have to look into the basics, but we can't throw it out, is what I'm saying. Yeah.
Right, I think it's important not to have onerous clauses, not to take onerous permissions when installing the app, but to look at what exactly you need and why you need it. And the clarity comes in when both the company knows what it's doing with the information, for how long, and where it's going to, and the same is communicated to the customer. And I think that will solve the entire, or go a long way actually in solving a lot of the disputes that we have today because of the disparity.
A couple of the panelists brought up time-based consent. How is that supposed to work? Isn't the user essentially trusting the data collector, the service provider, to do that for them?
So I think it can, it can function in many different ways, right? I think it can function at the OS level, where a consent runs out, apps can do it themselves. It's usually, the way it would work out is it would usually be some type of an agreement between an app and basically the underlying OS. So for instance, if it's MobiQuick and Google, maybe Google says that every few months, say 3 months or 6 months, you have to refresh the consent that you take from the users. Of course, this is consent, but and then every 3 months, then it's up to me how I figure out how to get that consent, whether I push a notification, whether I push an update, but I demonstrate then to the OS on which we are built that I have gotten this consent, and it's then recorded on both sides.
No, but if you already have historical data, you can be storing it offline and continuing use of that. Right?
So there are two different things, right? I think one is how much historical data do I have access to? That's one part of the question. And the second is, going forward, how frequently do I keep refreshing the data?
This is more of a data retention question. Yeah.
Fair enough. I mean, I think the data retention question, basically there need to be kind of policy guidelines around data retention, which which companies need to enforce, and then there are audit firms which actually go out and do it and basically check. They'll do dipsticks in certain cases, and they'll check, okay, I'm going to pick out whatever record number XXS, and let me look in 3 months and pull it out. So it's possible to verify it, but usually enforced through third-party audits.
So we spoke in this panel a little bit about self-regulation in terms of collection, usage of data, and possibly appointing a sort of an officer within a company who would sort of be in charge of data protection, etc. Now, in terms of law, as you know, we already have SPDI rules, etc. The problem with that, which already deals with things like disclosure, transfer, collection of data, privacy policy, and having a grievance officer as well within companies. Now, the problem with the rules is that it's limited to sensitive personal data or information, which is defined really, really narrowly, and lists out certain kinds of information. Now, how far do we think these same principles can be more broadly applied to general data, the kind that is collected by apps? And also, in the recent judgment by the Supreme Court on privacy, Justice Chandrachud has talked about things like data aggregation and the quantified self, which essentially means that the different kinds of data that may not be personal or sensitive in its fragments as it's collected is then aggregated to create a kind of information about an individual that the individual did not really have. So also getting into how consent then fails. But how do we deal with such databases that are now being created by apps? And how far can existing regulation really be broadly expanded, even in terms of self-regulation?
So actually we're releasing a piece, I hope, in the next couple of weeks, which I'll send around, which will deal with this in more detail. So I think a lot of what you're talking about is actually not related to the consent question at all. The consent is part of it. What Prashant was saying about rights and liabilities, which I think be the how we understand all of this, right? So I think my thinking or our thinking at this point is that certain types of rights will have, certain types of data will have rights associated with them, which are a bit more in the property framework, where you can set people right, you can pay them for their data, they can be used for services and so on. You then have an entire category where you have intellectual property, which could, like rights, you could have a whole new kind of data right, but you could have like something that you've created, which is like a copyright or an author's moral right, where even after you've sold it, there might be some non-economic interest that you have in terms of its manipulation, to that data quality point someone made, where it's all incorrect. You might have a right, maybe, in this beautiful world that we're in, where you can injunct someone from publishing stuff that's wrong about you, at least tell them to correct it. And then in the end, you have your whole digital persona. And again, there's a lot of academic literature and thinking, regulatory business thinking around this, where if you have a digital persona, that might be something that actually is an extension of yourself, right? And this is why the Supreme Court judgment is really big, because it's come straight into that kind of literature, and we're connecting the dots, and we'll try and get this out soon. But if you look at all the informational personhood, that kind of literature, basically it's saying that sometimes if your data, it's irrespective of whether it's on the cloud or it's on your person, there are certain parts of you that get human rights protection, right? And I think that will clarify the field for a lot of companies as well, because this will obviously have very different implications as a company if you're withholding someone's personal liberty. But if you're doing a fair exchange with someone and paying them for it or giving them a service, that's fine. So, and when I talk about principles, that's what I mean. I feel like that will also create a lot of clarity about what you shouldn't be messing with and what you can.
Okay, so last.
So just a quick thing, I think. I know everybody here who is in tech hates regulation, but there are a lot of industries who voluntarily jump in and demand regulation from the government. It was to a very simple point. If the liability, if you lose somebody's data, if you do harm, is huge, right, and that will cost you millions of dollars and lawsuits and etc., that there is an argument to go for what a lot of pharmaceutical companies have done, a lot of oil and gas have gone to the governments and said, look, we want a process-based regulation wherein you set a process for us to follow. We will follow that process. You certify this process. So whether it's getting from a US FDA or whatever you have it, if we follow that process, any outcomes from that process, if they are harmful, we are not held responsible for that because we followed your process. And for a lot of industries, this is a great calming influence because it removes that liability and legal data.
Okay,
sorry,
hold on, let him
oil and gas, pharmaceuticals, US FDA, etc. People follow. Well, okay, but I'm saying I know.
Prashant,
I know.
Just let him finish.
Prashant, sorry, no, valid point. I know the reason why I'm saying it. I know in the tech world there is a natural animosity regulation, but I do believe well-regulated markets and frameworks done in a right manner, which is a process-based, could be one of the answers for some of these thorny questions where the company doesn't want to take the liability that I've lost the data, etc., and they are searching for someone to certify them or to say that, look, if you follow these rules, we're not going to come after you, we're not going to sue you. There's an open thing for that.
So
name one
Prashant,
industry where
Prashant, I want Bhairav to actually comment on this one, on the process-based thing. I want to hear what you have to say.
Okay, name one industry where there's who has embraced the where there is not an incumbent leader. It's always not the industry. It's not tech versus non-tech. It's basically incumbent always want regulation as an entry barrier. What happened in pharma? It takes a couple of $1 million to all incumbent. Where there is established incumbent. Incumbent with lobbies get regulation. It's not tech or non-tech.
Right. So, I really don't have much to add. I just want to echo what Malvika was saying. I think it's really important that we first decide on first principles. So let's arrive at first principles and what regulation should look like, why it should look like that, and then apply it contextually across different sectors. Now, you know, it may not be appropriate at this point for us to, or for me to at this moment, go into what different processes should look like, and this might be a conversation we can have later. But broadly speaking, and this is again going back to a very high level, the idea that we must have context-based integrity for data regulation is, I think, the high-level principle that should apply across the board and for different processes and in different ways the data is used.